Yep, so welcome back everyone, as I said, to our first module of this autumn school titled Flexibility as Soft Authoritarian Technique. Now we all have to say, okay, that we accept the recording. And I especially welcome Professor John Keane, who will be giving the keynote speech today. Thank you for accepting our invitation. Professor John Keane is Professor of Politics at the University of Sydney, currently teaching at the Beijing Foreign Studies University, and was also for many years based at the Berlin Social Science Center, WZB, as Professor of Research. He is very well known for his extensive writings on democracy and the threats to it, on media, politics, and history. He is an author of The Life and Death of Democracy from 2009, When Trees Fall, Monkeys Scatter from 2017, Power and Humility from 2018, and most recently, The Short History of Democracy from 2022, just to name a few. And he has contributed widely to public debate in newspapers across the globe. For us here today, the book titled New Despotism, which was published in 2020, is key, and we have suggested 2 chapters in preparation to this for the discussion out of this book. Now, you might be surprised that we decided to invite a scholar who explicitly critiques the term authoritarianism in his work, for this event, which we call soft authoritarianism, and maybe he can share his critique both on authoritarianism, the term authoritarianism, and the term soft, as we discuss further today. But in fact, we share very similar questions. We are interested in understanding a form of government which seems to be very specific for our current times, a form of often very arbitrary, centralized, top-down government, which is by no means interested in power sharing, but nevertheless makes use of a range of seemingly democratic-looking techniques. A form of government which cannot easily be located in the binary between democracy and authoritarianism, but is a style of governing in its own right. In his book, John Keane analyzes these methods of rule with meticulous detail, drawing on a vast array of different regimes. He illustrates the ways in which these regimes govern, both with velvet fists, as you call it, John, and a myriad of phantom democratic techniques of governing, producing a system of voluntary servitude. What has been particularly inspiring for us in John Keane's book is how he highlights that these new despotisms are smart and insidious, or as Shalini Randeria has said, cunning. They are efficient and flexible and have the ability to learn and adapt. And that therefore they are far more resilient than we might want to hope for. These are aspects that we also try to capture with the term soft, and we'll debate whether this actually works with this term. Drawing on or in conversation with Montesquieu, John Keane asks us to rethink the concept of despotism for today, to understand the particular workings of this new art of governing and its overall dangers for democracy. Thanks again, John, for being with us here today. We'll have 45 minutes talk by John, and then we'll do 15 minutes break, as I mentioned, in case anyone wasn't there earlier on. And then we'll take up the discussion on the base of what questions you might have, or the readings that you've already read, or based on the research that you have done yourselves. We're very much looking for your talk, John. Thank you.
Well, herzlichen Dank, Ulrike. I wanted to say Gruß Gott. I'm in Vienna. I wanted to say, meine Damen und meine Herren, schönen guten Tag, herzlichen Dank für Ihre Einladung. Ich freue mich, heute bei euch allen zu sein. I'm very pleased to be with you at your autumn school, which I understand is pronounced yisares. And I wanted as well to say thank you very much to Jens, to Hagen, and of course to Ulrike again, and to Professor van der Rier for the invitation. Ladies and gentlemen, a few days ago, the American writer Anne Applebaum, addressing the World Movement for Democracy Assembly in Taipei, said this, and I quote, "Today," Applebaum remarked, "the most brutal autocrats don't much care if their countries are criticized. Autocrats are willing to pay the price of complete disaster, enter the category of failed states, accept economic collapse and mass poverty to stay in power." End of quote. I want you to note a number of presumptions in this paragraph about the recklessness of what Applebaum calls autocracies. Notice the lumping together of Iran, Myanmar, Cuba, Venezuela, China, and Russia. Notice and Belarus. Notice as well, there is a kind of running through that remark of Applebaum, a kind of political conformity to what could be called bipolar thinking, bipolarity. And it is, of course, a way of speaking and thinking, which is bears quite a few connections with Joe Biden's announcement in the past year of an historic struggle, which is unfolding, according to Biden, between autocracy and democracy. Note as well, running through Applebaum's remark, strong traces of what we could call Fukuyama thinking. That is a kind of teleology that supposes that history is still on the side of democracies, that these autocracies are fragile, reckless, and prone to self-destruction. And notice as well that deep in this remark by Anne Applebaum is the secret, hidden presumption that the United States is still the champion of liberal democracy. I want to contest in these remarks in the next half an hour or so, I want to contest each and every one of these precepts. And I want to try to do so by introducing and summarizing in this short time my thoughts on what I call the new despotisms. I'm referring here to the emergence during the past several decades of a new regime type in times of what many scholars and observers call cascading crises. That is, this is a period, a kind of Shakespearean moment where times, as you all know well, feel out of joint, where very many strange things are happening that have the feeling of being out of control, tendencies that are actually not only surprising, but very difficult to think. That is, making sense of the world becomes ever more a challenge. A world driven by the collapse of the Soviet Union, by European anxieties about its future, disorder in the Arab world, a belligerent Russia that has launched war on the Ukraine, a self-confident China, and a United States, which many observers are beginning to say might be considered to be an empire in decline, and certainly a policy pestilence that broke out in the early months of 2020. And if you add to this the banking crisis and the collapse of many banks in the 2008 and 2009 period, one has a sense of the novelty and the confusing qualities of our times. It's in this context that these new despotisms are born and in which they flourish. Yeah, so it's in this context of the rise of what I'm calling the new despotisms that there is, my second point, there is what Pierre Bourdieu, the French sociologist, famously called classification struggles. That is, there are efforts in the human sciences to make sense of these developments, and in particular to make sense of these new regimes. Saudi Arabia, Vietnam, China, Russia, Turkey, regimes such as Orban's Hungary, the list goes on. There are struggles to name these polities, to give them a name, to try to make sense of their dynamics, to better understand their institutional mechanisms, and to look at their weaknesses. It's in this period that I myself, methodologically speaking, am something of a supporter of what the French and French anthropologists have long called bricolage. That is, it's in periods like this that not only are there classification struggles, but also it's not such a bad thing that there is a proliferation of perspectives that compete to try to make sense of the times in which we live. This is all a way of saying that I have tried to retrieve this old category of despotism. The Germans would say that the method that I've used is a kind of Rettende-Kritik. That means this was a concept that flourished in the second half of the 18th century in Europe in particular, but also in Latin America and North America. It's a term that I tried to retrieve. It disappeared from public discourse roughly in the early decades of the 20th century. I've tried to revive it, to breathe new life into it, to reconstruct it, to use it to make sense of our times. And it's in this effort, this attempt to retrieve an old category, that I find myself, I hope we can discuss this point, I find myself at odds with the terminology that is orthodox when trying to describe and analyze the regimes that I'm about to talk about. For instance, the flourishing of the word autocracy, blessed by the President of the United States, but used by journalists Anne Applebaum, Masha Gessen, the Russian journalist who speaks about Putin's regime as an autocracy. Technically, this word autocracy is, I think, descriptively misleading. If you want to be pedantic about it, the word autocracy literally means, from the Greek, a single ruler who manipulates the whole political order, which bows down to him, usually him. What I'm going to suggest in these remarks to follow is that these despotisms are not to be understood as autocracies, because connections, patronage, clientelism, we can use these words, is a feature of these systems. There is an interconnectivity of actors and institutions in which even the ruler is deeply implicated. I think for that reason alone, the word autocracy may be good rhetoric, may be simplifying rhetoric, but it's descriptively misleading. I do not think that these regimes are describable as tyrannies. This is a very old word in the history of European political thinking that goes back again to the Greek world. Tyranny, technically, is a political regime that is based on fear and chaos. The kinds of regimes, let's say, of the last days of Robert Mugabe's Zimbabwe, where there's great disorder, there is great confusion, and there is great fear, and there is much violence. These despotisms, I'm going to try to suggest to you, are not describable as tyrannies. I do not think that these despotisms are accurately describable as kleptocracies. A kleptocracy is a regime that steals wealth and power from the subject population. John McCain, the American senator who passed away some years ago, once described Putin's Russia as a gas station masquerading as a state. You know, that this is just, according to McCain, and it's quite a widespread view, Putin's Russia is some kind of mafia state that robs the population of its wealth and power. In fact, what we're going to find in just a moment is that all of these despotisms practice patronage. They distribute patronage to various layers of the polity, and in all of them, state expenditure is very important. State expenditure on education or social policy, for instance. Some people speak of the new despotisms as fascist or as totalitarian. Technically, Hannah Arendt, I have in mind here, technically, a totalitarian regime of the kind that flourished in the early half of the 20th century and is found, for example, was found in Pol Pot's Cambodia, is a system of one-party rule, of total domination of the population, of the omnipresence of fear, of mass mobilization, mass rallies being very, very important for the building and sustainability of the regime. And these totalitarianisms were not only based on total fear and mass mobilization, but also on a comprehensive total ideology, a kind of coherent view of the world that is imposed upon the population. I do not think these despotisms are describable in these terms. I do not think, I'm running through a catalog of the competing terms, the classification struggles that are going on. I do not think that these regimes, Slavoj Žižek has said this, are simply capitalist regimes, or Branko Milanovic, for example, has also said something like that. These are, understandable as kind of harsh capitalist regimes. Things are more complicated. I do not think that the phrase hybrid regimes should be used to describe these despotisms. In my view, this phrase is a nonsense phrase. It's not clear. Its meaning is not clear. A hybrid regime is said to have some elements of democracy, some elements of authoritarianism, but the balance among them isn't clear. It's not a very useful and plausible descriptor, in my view. And finally, this dog-tired word, authoritarianism, which has been circulating among intellectuals and journalists, and to some extent has entered the public domain in various countries in recent years. I too have some serious doubts about the category of authoritarianism and why they should be called soft authoritarianism. It's a rather gendered adjective, soft. It doesn't seem to me, for reasons that we should talk about at length, it doesn't seem to me that the category of authoritarianism is a wise category or a useful descriptor. Instead, I want to revive rejuvenate, reconstruct this old category of despotism. And I do so because one of the features of this old term, it was revived by figures like Montesquieu in the middle of the 18th century. It had a tremendous life in the second half of the 18th century in the Atlantic region. It was used, of course, as part of the poetry, if you like, in the preparation of the French Revolution. It played a very important role during the American Revolution of the mid-1770s. And it spread globally thereafter before actually going into some kind of invisibility during the course of the 20th century. I want to revive it because one of the central ideas, one of the central precepts, if you like, of this category is voluntary servitude. I think that it's something like a freiwillige Knechtschaft. Those who used it worried, they were fascinated by, and in the 18th century, worried about the ability of top-down power to actually persuade its subjects to be loyal, to submit, to give themselves away to top-down power. And this is a clue as to why it is that they want to use this old term to revive it, to describe regimes that it seems to me all of them have this quality of nurturing, of producing, of nurturing, of sustaining voluntary servitude. Third point, I hope that during the discussion we'll have a chance to talk about other advantages, both descriptive and normative and strategic, three ways that all concepts can be used in the human sciences, that we'll have a chance to talk about the advantages of the category of despotism. I repeat again that the category has much to teach us about the dynamics of ruling and the way that power can exercise charm, the way in which it can seduce populations, in which, in other words, it's a category that encourages us to think less of the way that these despotisms rule through the fist, through brute power, and more encourages us more to think about the way that power appears not to be repressive, but is actually productive of life. That it's a form of power that cultivates the phenomenon of voluntary servitude. The fourth point that I want to make, and here I come to really fleshing out the category of despotism, to speak about these new despotisms. It is, of course, an ideal type, as Max Weber would say. That is to say, it's a generalizing category that doesn't correspond exactly to the complexities of the so-called real world. The attempt that I make in this book and that I'm suggesting this afternoon, the attempt I'm making is to focus on the genus rather than the species of different regimes. I mean, these despotisms are all not cut from the same cloth, or to shift metaphors, not all dogs are Dalmatians. There is a great variety in the way that they operate. But what seems to me important is to understand their common characteristics. And in particular, the way that these despotisms are regimes that specialize in smart, seductive power. It is true that these despotisms experience Alice in Wonderland moments, moments when sheep shouts and where flowers talk, where queens shout and call for off with their heads and so on. These bizarre moments that are deeply ironic and absurd. For instance, a speech that Erdogan, the leader in Turkey, recently, not so long ago, made, where he said, quote, Turkey's rise will not be obstructed by anyone except God. And he said this seriously. This generated some laughter among the subjects of his rule. Or think of the regime of Kim Jong-un. It is in transition to a new despotism, in my view. You may not know, but whenever Kim Jong-un in the past, before COVID, traveled, that everywhere he went, his feces were bagged up and his urine was bagged up because he was paranoid that these might get into the hands of his enemies who might do tests to determine his health. Putin, you may know, has a food taster. There are despots like Niazov, who was the ruler of Turkmenistan, who, when the meteorologists occasionally got weather forecasts wrong, sacked the whole of the state meteorological office and replaced them with his own men. Or think of Lukashenko in Belarus at the beginning of the COVID-19 pestilence. Lukashenko spoke about the psychosis of COVID-19, for which he recommended the cure of vodka and saunas. So there are these Alice in Wonderland moments. But what I want to say in these remarks this afternoon is that these regimes tend to be whip smart. They tend to be nimble. They tend to be learning regimes. They have a definite resilience. And this raises the question of what are the sources of this resilience, this durability of top-down power that I'm calling despotism. Well, one of the important conceptual points I want to say is that these regimes, in all of their complexity and diversity, have recombinant features. That is to say, a number of dynamics converge. You have to understand this recombinant quality of the despotisms because they help us grasp their inner resilience, their durability. And these recombinant features that I'm about to sketch lend these despotisms a kind of learning quality, a shape-shifting quality. They have a kind of kaleidoscopic quality, and this enables them to build shock absorbers. It enables them to actually withstand blows of a kind that regularly happen inside these regimes. So what are these features of the new despotisms? I have a small handful, which I'd like just to summarize. You can read about this in the chapters that were circulated or in the wider book and in other writings. These are top-down systems of arbitrary power, no doubt. But they have what I call a quality of phantom democracy. Phantom democracy. The word phantom shouldn't be misunderstood. This is not a word to describe something that's simply false. You know, a phantom pregnancy is real and not real. And in these regimes, they have a feeling of being democratic, but in fact, the spirit and substance of democracy is in very short supply. What am I referring to here? All of these regimes, with a couple of exceptions, practice elections. all of them experiment with the arts of cultivating voluntary servitude. In every one of these regimes, I've tried to say, the rulers are skittish, they're nervous, they worry about the loss of power, their loss of power at all levels in the system. And they therefore acknowledge that their power depends upon the cultivation of public loyalty, that public opinion is very important. This is an old principle in the analysis of power and politics, that brutal, tough-fisted rule is not durable rule, that no regime, they understand, no regime can survive through time unless it has the loyalty of its subjects. And hence, in this idea of phantom democracy highlights the way in which there's constant talk of the people. You could even say, I tried to write about this, you could even say that these despotisms are forms of state-managed populism. You know, there are leaders at various levels, including the despot-in-chief, who talk the people, who claim to be manifestations of the people. So they have a phantom democratic quality. There's also another feature that explains the resilience of these regimes, and it is, if you like, the recombinant quality of the ruling language. To put it in very plain English, these are not systems that are describable in terms of, say, George Orwell's 1984 or a novel like Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, in which there is strict censorship and there is one line, one language that is imposed upon the whole population. Actually, those who rule in the new despotisms tend to wear coats of many colors. If you like to switch similes, they speak in tongues. In the book, I talk about these as forms of vaudeville government. Vaudeville was a popular entertainment medium in the 1920s and 30s in Europe and elsewhere, where they were like circuses in which there was something for everybody: jugglers, fire eaters, animals, animal trainers, acrobats, high wire acts, and so on. There is, in other words, a kind of rainbow quality to the ruling language. And we can talk about that more, but I would illustrate this by urging you to think, for instance, of the language of Xi Jinping. And I like to say that, you know, on a Monday, Xi Jinping gives a straight talk about the importance of socialism with Chinese characteristics. On a Tuesday, he will talk about ancient Chinese civilization and its Confucian and Taoist traditions. On a Wednesday, he will give a speech about ecological civilization and the importance of protecting our environments. Talk that could have been drafted by Greenpeace International. And on a Thursday, he will talk reform, markets, innovation, and when you look at the range of discourses that he, so to say, speaks, that these don't add up. They have a kind of eclectic quality. And that's the point, that this kaleidoscopic quality of the ruling language of these despotisms makes them appear, it adds to their shape-shifting quality, it makes them appear as if there is something for everybody. This is not, to repeat, these are not regimes in which there is a coherent, single-minded, totalizing ideology. These are beyond ideology in that sense. Their resilience, their shape-shifting quality, their whip smartness is enhanced by another feature, which I want to mention. And that is that all of these despotisms nurture, protect, consolidate what anthropologists and sociologists call clientelism. There are various words for this, kompromat in Russian. Blat is also used. Wasta in the Arab despotisms. Guangxi is the Chinese word. What does this mean? It means that these are regimes in which there is patronage, connections that run from top to bottom. Whatever you want to do at the top, secure a business deal, get state permission to invest, your corporation to invest in a particular town or region. If you want to do that, you will have to get permission from the ruling political authorities, and you will have to make compromises. There will have to be behind the scenes deals. But it's also true throughout the system as you go from top to bottom. If you want to renew your driving license, then there is a quick way of doing it in which you would pay money, or you would offer a favor to someone who enables you to do so. And the upshot is that corruption is chronic. This is not a weakness of the regime, of these regimes. It's actually a source of stability. This is a paradoxical feature that needs to be understood. The Polish sociologist Adam Podgorecki long ago used the term dirty solidarity. And this, I think, this phrase applies well to these despotisms. Everybody is implicated from top to bottom in a system of patronage, in a system of vassalage, in a system of clientelism. If you have difficulty grasping this point, I urge you to have a look at a film, a great film by the Iranian filmmaker Mohammad Rasulov. It's called A Man of Integrity. It is about Iran, and it's strangely topical. It is about the omnipresence of corruption and the immorality, that the culture of immorality that settles on the whole regime and shapes everybody's lives. It follows from this patronage feature of the new despotisms that at the very top, there is what Hungarian sociologists call oligarchy. It's a term that I've also used in my writings. These are state capitalist regimes that have a certain mafia quality to them. This is the idea of the Hungarian sociologist Balint Magyar. Billionaires at the top are commonplace. In China, on average, for the past decade and longer, more than 2 new billionaires a week are created. During 2020, during the lockdowns, the great pestilence, over 270 billionaires became billionaires in China. So these are regimes in which, yes, wealth and power are concentrated at the top, in which there is, as a consequence, plutocracy. And there are figures, oligarchs like, for instance, Viktor Orban's high school friend, whose name is Lorenz Mesharos. He was actually a gas fitter from the small town where they were together as friends in their teenage years, who is now the richest man in Hungary. He was once on the point of bankruptcy. He has become a multi-billionaire. And he said recently, not so recently, in the last several years, he told journalists, quote, "My fortune is thanks to 3 facts: God, luck, and Viktor Orban." It's the case that these regimes are top-down systems of power and they have a plutocratic quality, but another source of resilience of these regimes is that these trends are tempered by state welfare schemes. I think, to repeat, these are not kleptocracies, these are not gangster states. In Russia, in Putin's Russia, more than 50% of the population in their everyday lives is directly dependent or indirectly dependent mainly on state spending. In China, 2/3 of GDP is processed by state institutions. And in the past several decades, as you probably know, there's been a push towards universal education, the massive expansion of universities, for instance, the extension of healthcare, pension systems, and other welfare mechanisms. In some of these despotisms, there are very sophisticated mechanisms of state spending and partial redistribution. In Singapore, the state taxes that are collected, GST, every year there is some portion of the taxes collected by the government that are redistributed to the population in the form of a bonus. So these regimes, these despotisms, I come to an end quite shortly, are systems that learn how better to rule. They do all that they can to secure the voluntary servitude of their populations, including their middle classes. All of them have a middle class, and those middle classes tend to be loyal to the regime. They are beneficiaries of the regime. There are, of course, dirty tricks that are played by these despotisms. One of them, very common, is the taming and politicization, the neutralization of the judiciary. These are not systems of rule of law, where arbitrary power is not allowed to flourish, that nobody is above the law. On the contrary, these are systems in which there is rule through law, in which there are regular public attacks through the media on what Erdogan calls the juristocracy, or what Russians call telephone justice. These are also regimes in which violence is calibrated. Calibrated coercion is practiced. There's a Chinese proverb that one good way of ruling is occasionally to kill a chicken to scare monkeys. This, I think, applies to these regimes. Of course, these regimes are heavily armed, and they are heavily armed in part because they're helped by democracies. British technology is used by the Chinese government in Xinjiang, or the French do massive arms deals to the Saudi Arabian despotism, for instance. But there is, in these regimes, armed to the teeth with great resources of sophisticated violence to repress disorder, as we see in Iran at this very moment. There is, at the very top, an awareness of the dangers of violence getting out of hand, the dangers of what the French, Romanian playwright Eugene Ionesco famously called rhinoceritis. That is, there is an awareness at the top that rough pushing and shoving, rampaging each other with power can get out of hand, in which nobody is safe. So there is a kind of selectivity, a sophistication in the use of violence. Violence comes in a velvet form. It comes stalking masked. There are tactics such as the attempted murder and successful murder of the Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi, for example. The attempt to hide away the violence. It was, of course, exposed. The same could be said about the violence that is heaped upon the Uyghur peoples in Xinjiang, or the treatment of figures, opposition figures like Alexei Navalny, who is in prison. The point is that there is violence, but the population does not feel on a daily basis that they are the victims or the objects or the targets of violence. There is a definite cleverness, a kind of Klugheit of power. Finally, it's important to see that these despotisms rely upon mechanisms of surveillance, of watching, of using early warning detectors to learn how better to rule. They are, of course, media-saturated, digitally networked regimes. I've mentioned already that the ruling language has a kind of recombinant quality. Yes, there is gaslighting. Lies are told. There is a lot of bullshit. There is fake news. There is cherny PR, black PR, such as the use of phrases like limited military operation, Putin. Government, however, uses sophisticated techniques to rule by using digital networked media, newspapers, radio, television, online platforms are part of the governing apparatus. And these despotisms always have at the top what I call in the book media magicians, characters like Errol Orchak, who was for many years before his death in the coup several years ago, attempted coup, was the advisor, the media advisor of Erdogan, or Surkov, who was Putin's advisor. All of these regimes use Telegram, TikTok, some version of it, Facebook, Instagram, WeChat, Weibo, which is the Chinese Twitter. All of them use these media to detect dissatisfaction. They learn from the feedback that comes amidst all of the manipulation. So that, and the penetration runs very deep. In China, for instance, on Weibo, which is the Chinese Twitter, platforms like People's Daily, Renmin Ribao, have over 150 million followers. So the point is that media is mobilized to try to secure what the Chinese call good governance. Good governance. And here I draw to an end because I want to just highlight some of the mechanisms that are used by these despotisms to secure what is called, what they call good governance. I've mentioned elections already. These are elections without democracy. They are forms of what Thomas Jefferson, the co-writer of the American Declaration of Independence and later president, called elective despotism. Elections are very important. We should talk about them. They are staged, they are manipulated, to be sure, but they are useful as early warning detectors. In 2009, for instance, they sometimes go wrong. In Iran, exactly that happened. You know, the election became a mobilizing point for those who were upset with the regime. It was an event, by the way, in which the Iranian government accused me and two other intellectuals, Jürgen Habermas and Richard Rorty, as being the leaders of the Velvet Counter-Revolution, as they put it, and they prosecuted hundreds of journalists, writers, intellectuals, claiming that we were CIA, MI5, MI6 agents. I still haven't received my paycheck from that period. All these regimes use public opinion polling, like the Levada Center in Russia. All of them have think tanks. Some of them operate outside of these despotisms. For instance, in Belgrade, there is an International Relations and Sustainability Center called CIRSD, which is co-funded by the Chinese government. Or today in Russia, you will know that there is a think tank called the Valdai Discussion Club. It's a Kremlin-affiliated research institute where Putin is said to be about to deliver a major foreign policy speech. The use of digital platforms is widespread in these regimes. They are platforms used to elicit support, to hear what people have to say if they dare to say it. There are these public forums, for example, are commonplace in China. Network hearings, they are called in Guangzhou. There are bodies, as in Vietnam, which are called persistent threat units. I mean, their job is to monitor, to put under surveillance the population, to detect, they're early warning detectors, to detect trouble, which can threaten the regime. There are bodies, very surprisingly perhaps for you, as in the United Arab Emirates, called happiness forums. So at various levels of the system, there are bodies that whose job is to not only promote the happiness of subjects, but to get people to speak about how happy they are and why they are unhappy and what is the sources of their unhappiness. There is, in the most sophisticated of these despotisms, a strong, acute awareness of the dangers of bubbles developing in the economy and the need to regulate, for example, banks. Sunshine investment is a phrase that you will find in China. And indeed, in China, there is a whole city on the edge of Beijing called Beijing Fund Town, where all credit and banking institutions, foreign and Chinese, are expected to locate so that there can be better scrutiny, better regulation of risky investments to prevent bubbling. And some of these despotisms, I'm thinking of the most sophisticated like Singapore, have had for many years reach groups, policy feedback groups, and so on. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to bring this to an end. If I had time, I would want to say more, I hope we can discuss it, about despotic trends inside actually existing democracies. One of the reasons why I feel discomfort with the Joe Biden and Applebaum autocracy versus democracy is that it forgets not only that so-called democracies are agents of, often supporters of these despotisms, I've mentioned some examples, but also that inside actually existing democracies, you can see this in the phenomenon of populist rule, for instance. Inside actually existing democracies, there are despotic trends. I hope we can talk about them. And finally, I haven't said very much about the weaknesses of these despotisms. They certainly, depending on the context, they certainly suffer structural problems. They suffer moments of disloyalty, sometimes moments of great disloyalty, as in Belarus during the past 12 months, or as in Iran currently. But these are regimes that put on the table, so to say, the question of how best to deal with them. How should actually existing democracies tackle these despotisms? Through tariffs, through trade embargoes. This is one way of understanding how, or of recommending how to deal with them. Are these regimes prone to war? Well, Putin's Russia clearly is, and so too is the Saudi regime in its war on the Yemen. I have no immediate, I will not suggest any immediate remedies, tactical or strategic. I haven't said very much about the normative advantages of democracy and the normative disadvantages of these despotisms. But what I want to say to you, meine Damen und Herren, ladies and gentlemen, is that these despotisms, if I am right about their resilience, are going to be around for a while. And so we'd better begin thinking carefully about them, how to defend best ways of life we consider to be precious, because otherwise I think these despotisms may well turn out to be the future of democracy. Thank you very much.